Hello, everyone, and welcome to this latest Dow Jones webinar, Know Your Cargo, How Sanctions Compliance Has Gotten More Complex. Last December, the departments in the US government departments of Commerce, Treasury, Justice, State, and Homeland Security all set out together how various compliance risks were particularly acute across the logistics, transportation, and maritime shipping sector. And that Quintessential compliance note highlighted sanctions evasion techniques, described how companies should implement and strengthen sanctions controls. It also introduced, to me at least, a new phrase. So we've had know your customer for ages and ages and ages. We've had know your third party. We've had know your supplier. And now we had know your cargo. So I knew we had to do a webinar on it because whenever we get a new phrase, know your something, we've got to figure out what does it actually mean. So we're going to do that today and look at some of the guidance around it. Now, if you've been on one of our webinars before, you'll know this, but I wanted to remind you, there is a Q&A section on the platform that you can write your questions into, and there will be plenty time in the during the webinar and at the end for you to ask questions and for us to answer them. If we don't get to all of the questions, and we often don't, then we will do our best to try and follow up. Now, my 16-year-old son is becoming an expert on shipping and logistics as he's tracking the return of various items back to China that he wasn't in the house to take receipt of. I did think of having him on this webinar to describe how logistics works in practice, but I thought better of it. Instead, we've got three absolutely perfect people to sort of dive into this subject to discuss the complexities of sanctions compliance in the context of shipping and logistics. We've got Vedya Edelman, Head of Global Trade Law Office for the Americas at DHL. We've got Michelle Bockman, who's a Principal Analyst at Lloyd's List Intelligence. And Anne-Marie Lacourse, our Global Trade Advisor, who works very closely with Dow Jones. But if you've been in this space for any period of time, you will have come across her on many occasions, as she's a sort of renowned expert in this field. I'm Gavin Proudley. I lead the third-party risk proposition at Dow Jones Risk and Compliance. So, just a reminder, there's a Q&A piece. You can ask questions. You'll also be able to get this this recording after completion. So going into it, Anne-Marie, I mean, I don't think there's like a month or even a week at the moment that goes by where there isn't more guidance, regulation, advice coming from some part of some government around the world, telling organizations how they need to take more care, have more controls around trade, sanctions, export control, etc. I think it feels like that world of trade compliance has gone from being a pretty back office function where a few people knew about those folk back there who, you know, maybe they were in the legal department and they did some weird stuff, but they didn't come out of their office very often, and they knew a lot of codes. They were all about codes. And they were over there, and no one worried about them. Now it feels like they're on the front line, and the trade compliance is, you know, a super hot topic, and an area that everyone really needs to know about. Why has that happened? What are the drivers for it?
That's an excellent question. And there's not necessarily one driver for it, but I will say we were so happy just to get out of the basement, to get to the back office, to have an office. So yes, trade compliance has become incredibly visible. It's always been there. And anyone who's ever had anything stuck in customs certainly appreciates that we know all these codes. But what really is going on is kind of a Rubik's Cube, if you will, of drivers. And I think one of the first ones is attention. Basement to the back office to, in reality, trade compliance is a materially relevant part of business continuity, business resiliency, and of course, compliance. And the focus moving from KYC, know your customer, to KYC squared, know your cargo, know your commodity, was in some respect a natural evolution to getting a broader picture of the risk that you're bringing into your organization. And then I would say third is, the third side of that Rubik's Cube is really around enforcement. So, when things are being held up or seized, you're finding out that you need an export license to do really any business in technology with certain countries. That definitely gets the powers that be's attention. And then I would say the fourth aspect of the driver for this has been that governments are far more coordinated than they used to be. And the expectations that they have for businesses, banks, etc., to conduct due diligence across their entire value chain, across their entire business, and the results of that due diligence on the products that you're buying, where you're buying them from, for what purpose, and who you're selling to, why, in what quantity, should lead to commercial decision making and embedding the due diligence results into existing management systems. That's operationally disruptive. And because they've used so much real estate in all of these, enforcements, cases in new regulations and guidance, use so much real estate detailing expectations around due diligence, it gives you something to hold as a standard. Trade compliance is a broad category, but primarily it's trade sanctions as opposed to economic sanctions, and export controls, import controls. Just to make sure everybody is reminded, there are three types of export controls. There's list-based, which makes a lot of sense. That's these codes that Gavin had referred to. Meaning if your product is this code, it's controlled. And then there's end user controls. And a lot of the export controls around end users, companies are very familiar with. That's part and parcel of know your customer, know your supplier, etc. And then end use controls. End use means, what is your customer going to use this product for? What are they going to do with it? What does that company do with any of these products? And does that lead to a control on selling to them? So that's a real quick background on a pretty complex topic that is evolving.
Yeah. I have a phrase that I find myself using far too often, actually, which is organizations need to know more about more of their value chain. They need to go further into their suppliers, understanding their suppliers, nth tier suppliers. I mean, if we think about UFLPA, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, telling companies they really need to know if they've touched an entire region of China. So on the supply side, there's new regulations across Europe as well, telling them you need to know more about your supply chain. And then you need to know more about more of your value chain, your customers as well. And you describe, all of the new regulations around military end use. So there's no doubt from my perspective that the organizations we're talking to at Dow Jones is they are having to understand more about their value chain. And, I think the other point I just make that I'm sure you agree with, Anne-Marie, is this is all in the context of some pretty big geopolitical tensions.
Mm-hmm.
Russia invasion of Ukraine is an obvious example, but as important in a way for many organizations is the situation, the tensions between China and the US that are having an impact on supply chains and logistics there. So those two geopolitical issues are not going away anytime soon. And for me, as someone who's worked in government a long, long time ago, export controls, sanctions are now a fundamental and profoundly important part of foreign policy execution around the world.
Yep.
So that's a backdrop. Let's get into the detail. And I'm reading from this Quint Seal compliance note, and it says, I'll make sure I won't get it wrong, companies must institutionalize sanctions and export control compliance programs. So they've got to institutionalize compliance programs, and they should develop, implement, and adhere to written, standardized, risk-based operational compliance policies, procedures, standards, conducts, and safeguards. I'm interested, Anne-Marie, you seem to indicate that there was, somewhat precise guidance. My view sometimes is there's a lot of words, not always a lot of specific guidance. So, Vedia, I'm interested in your role. You're having to read all of this advice, take account of it. It's always changing. You're having to actually build that institutionalized compliance program. So at DHL, what does that look like? And how have you had to adapt it as the
Yeah. Sorry.
I should precede this by saying Vedia has been amazingly keen to do this webinar, so keen that she's ignored the fact that all of her family is ill somewhere else in the building, and they may well not be very well at all, but we're going to crack on.
Yeah, apologies. So I can't take the credit for having built the institutional system at DHL. I was very fortunate enough to actually come into it last year. Just by way of background, before joining DHL, I worked at various global law firms, DC offices, practicing trade law. And so I've had the benefit of seeing what this institutional structure looks like at various companies of various sizes, industries. I'm very proud to say DHL has actually done that. And what that looks like is, Gavin, I agree with you. I think a lot of the times the guidance from the US government is fairly broad and vague, purposefully so probably. But we do know that it has to have management support, management backing, and we do thankfully have that. In terms of the structure, I think it's important for the trade compliance function to be independent of the business. So I'll just try to explain what we've done at DHL to ensure that. So my office is the Global Trade Law Office, and we do not sit in any of the 4 DHL divisions, which are DHL Express, Freight Forwarding, Supply Chain, and E-commerce. Each of those 4 divisions have a global export compliance officer that is responsible globally for that division's export compliance. And they don't report to my office, but they work very closely with my office, which is independent again from all those 4 divisions. My office reports to the Chief Compliance Officer of DHL Group, who is also the General Counsel of DHL Group. This structure makes sure that we are independent and that we have this governance and oversight function. So my office sets the policies group-wide that each division must stick with and implement and enforce. And then each division is responsible for going ahead and enforcing and implementing it. And we do a self-assessment and a risk assessment. And then, well, each division does a self-assessment and a risk assessment, and then they report back to us and we evaluate the assessments. So that's the structure that we've set up to make sure that we have this institutional compliance structure that is independent and with that governance and oversight function. It is very important to have management support, because a lot of the times I've seen companies where the management wasn't taking export compliance seriously. So it doesn't even matter if they've hired an export compliance officer just to show it on paper if they don't listen to what that compliance officer has to say. It's really important to understand that the risk of non-compliance and the cost of non-compliance is greater than any investment that needs to be made to comply. And then there's the company culture, which is really important. It's important to build an institution that does not bury their head in the sand or turn the other way or say, yeah, but who's going to catch us? Because they will. It will come out. Especially with the new BIS policy that's encouraging companies to report on one another. I was at the BIS update 2 weeks ago, and the numbers have increased by, I can't, don't quote me on this, I think 400% in terms of companies reporting on one another. So it is very, very important to be backed by management, to have the compliance-minded culture, to not tolerate what I call the criminal mindset, which is, yeah, but we're not going to get caught. And to have that independent compliance structure so that you don't have to worry about your performance because it's not evaluated by the business. You're independent. Your job is to make sure they're complying. And another thing that I recommend now for large companies like DHL, another thing that's I think really important is to have a working relationship with the U.S. government, with the agencies, to be fully transparent with them, to cooperate with them, to help them as much as possible, because it should be a dialogue, and we should be feeding each other knowledge so that we can both do our jobs better.
Yeah.
In terms of smaller companies, it does get trickier. Again, I think each company has to take a risk-based approach. And one thing that I've seen in my former life as a law firm attorney and in my current role is certain companies, and this goes with some of our customers too now, like they don't want to be convinced that they have to do something if it's not strictly explicitly stated in the regulations. But that's not how U.S. export controls and sanctions work.
Yeah.
OFAC is not going to say you must screen, you must use a screening software. They assume you already know that. Yeah. And it's not going to be written in the regulations.
Yeah. And although it's quite interesting how, that use of technology is now a sort of pretty explicit in, I'm thinking OFAC's guidance on what a sanctions compliance program looks like. Equally, DOJ guidance on what an anti-corruption program looks like. I think the expectation is there. If you're a medium-sized to large company and you ain't using technology to help you with this, what are you doing? But it's interesting because I continue to meet organizations where they're still doing it in SharePoint. Nothing wrong with SharePoint, but they're kind of not leveraging some of the best technology that's
and
out
you
there.
see it in the enforcement actions. You see that as a damaging factor, so like aggravating factor. So
So just, I mean, DHL is such a well-known brand. But as a logistics provider, I mean, are there specific risks that apply to you that maybe don't, we'll have people on this webinar who are working for manufacturers, people who are working for financial institutions. And by the way, thank you to all those that are already asking questions about what banks need to do. We are going to get to that. But as a logistics company, are there specific risks that are like really niche to you?
Yeah, absolutely. I think part of the challenge that we're facing is we're in the middle of the transaction, right? Like we're not the buyer, we're not the seller, we're the logistics provider. So we may not always have all the details and the paperwork and the information or the data, and we rely on the customers to provide them to us. And a lot of the challenges that we're facing is sometimes we have some customers who are like, well, show me the legal requirement for me to provide you a copy of our export license.
Yeah.
And we're like, well, we can't ship it if we don't know that it's covered within the scope of a license. Because this technology or software, like this thing that you're asking us to ship, it's controlled. So that's probably the biggest challenge that we're facing is the lack of sharing from our customers of copies of licenses that are relevant for us in terms of compliance. Another thing that is challenging for us is the way I view the logistics providers is the way I view financial institutions and banks in financial transactions. To me, logistics providers are to commodity transactions what banks are in financial transactions. We are that point where we can stop transactions and must stop transactions. So we feel the burden of being the responsible party to stop whatever transaction would result in a violation.
So it's interesting. You're almost feeling a burden to act as an arm of an enforcement agency, which I know is also a sense that some banks have.
Exactly.
We're gonna come back to that because there's a lot of questions coming in. And I want to get to those, but Michelle, I want to bring it on to another point in the Quincy note, which is focused on the techniques being used to evade sanctions, and it talks about shipping in particular. And I know you've been doing a lot of work around this sort of phenomenon of the dark fleet. And I wanted you to use this opportunity to kind of, and it's an awful pun, bring that to light. This isn't just, Lloyd's List isn't just about tracking where ships are at any given point in time. And, they've got a fantastic resource in understanding the complexities of the shipping industry. And I'm really interested in you helping us understand, what does this phrase dark fleet mean? And I think, I can't be right. There's a company called Shadow Fleet Limited or something. Anyway, what does it mean? You may be on mute.
There's always somebody, isn't there?
And I knew that would happen when I asked you to go on mute when you're not speaking.
Okay. Dark fleet, shadow fleet, ghost fleet, parallel fleet. There's lots of names. It means different things to different people. But this fleet has evolved directly in response to Western sanctions on Iranian, Venezuelan, and Russian oil and shipping sectors. And it operates outside Western sanctions, and it won't appear in standard checks if you punch in the IMO number of a vessel to see whether or not it's sanctioned. What we have had to do is we've developed a methodology to try and get some data and slice and dice that data so we can get some insights into the operating structure and regulatory themes. And so I'm just going to run that through very, very quickly, just so when I give you some statistics to follow, you'll know exactly what that encompasses. So it's tankers that are aged 15 years or over. They have to be anonymously owned, so you don't know who the beneficial owner is. They have to be solely deployed in sanctioned trades. And then finally, they have to deploy one or more of these evasive shipping practices that are mentioned in not only in the Quint Seal note, but in prior notifications from the US government. And that can range from ship-to-ship transfers in international waters outside port state control scrutiny to these deliberately obtuse corporate structures. I mean, I've tracked addresses for, a ship manager to a shopping mall in Dubai. I think I had a pharmacy in Moldova last week. It's threatening the regulatory integrity of global trade. And as well as knowing your cargo, it sort of it's a reason to know your vessel as well, especially if you're shipping bulk goods. So once I've assembled that data, and I should mention that the dark fleet is sanctions agnostic, so we don't make any judgment about whether or not sanctions are being breached for this fleet because it depends on the jurisdiction. Shipping's an international industry. What counts as a breach in the US probably doesn't count as a breach in Dubai, for example. So there's 600 tankers, more or less. 600 tankers, 12% of the internationally trading fleet. Now, that number was less than 300 before Russia invaded Ukraine. And the dark fleet kind of went on steroids when that happened. And so it's more than doubled. And I like to use the concept of regulatory arbitrage. So these anonymous owners have really gone for the lowest possible barrier into entry. So when you look at what is a dark fleet, there are, I can sort of go through everything. There's no time. But for example, if you had a Gabon flagged oil tanker that had an ISM manager in Dubai, its registered owner was a single company structure in the Marshall Islands, and it was classed with the Indian Register of Shipping, I would say you need to do some additional checks. So that's very much what the dark fleet is. About half of those vessels are deployed in Russian oil trades, where you have the G7 price cap, which is providing, a lot of challenges for Western marine service providers, insurers, and banks that want to, or that have clients in this area, but they need to make sure that everything is price cap compliant. With the caveat, of course, that the assessed price of all Russian crude at the moment is, from price reporting agencies, assessed above the cap, yet we still have vessels trading in that area, which takes us into the effectiveness of the cap, which is not a subject of today's webinar. But I can say that Iran and North Korea are very much at the vanguard of a lot of these deceptive shipping practices. And especially recently, we've seen a massive increase in the manipulation and what we call spoofing of the AIS, or the automatic identification signals, which are vessel tracking transponders on ships. And we've also seen a very, very intense crackdown from OFAC, as well as related UK and European regulators, on not only the Russian oil price cap, but on Iranian shipping. And so the environment now is very much one, as we said, know your cargo, know your vessel.
And is this relating mainly to oil, petrochemicals, or is it other commodities, other products as well that are using this sort of shipping techniques?
Sure. So the dark fleet within my methodology only includes tankers, but those shipping practices are seen elsewhere. There was a recent case, for example, of a container ship that had gone dark, had manipulated its IAS. It called it North Korea. It was a container ship, loaded arms for Russia, called it Russia, and of course those arms went on to fight the war in Ukraine. So you're seeing it particularly in North Korea. In the Black Sea, we're seeing deceptive shipping practices and obfuscation used for grain smuggling out of Ukraine. And especially in particular regions in the Black Sea. So it's widespread, and it's becoming more sophisticated every time we determine and detect a new practice. They find, they ramp it up a little bit. So it's very much a whack-a-mole game at the moment.
And is there a company called Shadow Fleet SA, or is it called that?
Look, there's all sorts of amazing names, but there is one called Shadow Ship Management.
Shadow Ship Management.
They're just taking the,
I'm making no judgment about the standards or ethics of Shadow Ship Management.sa. I'm just
company in Moldova.
Great name for a company. Okay. My 16-year-old went on fakeid.com to guess what? Fake ID. I couldn't believe it. It's a proper website. Anyway, I'm at risk of advertising. Anne-Marie, we've talked about what a logistics firm like DHL is doing. We've heard about this issue of that's specific to shipping around dark fleet. If you're an quote unquote ordinary manufacturer, what are the changes that have come in recently that are meaning you are having to do more? How are you looking at this, the risks that are associated particularly with the supply chain aspect, the logistics aspect? If you're just a manufacturer in Europe, the US, or Asia, you're wanting to get your goods from A to B, what are the practices that you're now having to do today that maybe you didn't have to do, 2 years ago, 3 years ago, or 5 years ago?
Mm-hmm. Well, whatever you were doing back in the day, generally speaking, the global governments, banks, insurance companies are expecting you to do a whole lot more of it, more often, of higher quality, and that you're conducting all of that in a centralized fashion. So there, we talk a lot about, sanctions, and it's the idea that there are individuals, there's companies, there's regions of the world that you can't do business with. And then there are individuals that you may be able to do business with, or maybe not. And this is where the complexity of what you need to do has also expanded greatly. There's entire authorities that have been created to which international trade is subject to. So the idea of simply screening your shipment and nobody's on, the OFAC list, nobody's on, the terrorist list, and packing up the box and shipping it out is just not at all acceptable anymore. And the movement away from list-based to essentially narrative guidance means that there's a lot of opportunity to be creative in how you put this into practice. Fortunately, the guidance does give us fence posts. And a lot of it is around correct classification. And, you mentioned these codes earlier. So some of it's very boring, fundamental, tactical work within your organization to determine the origin, the actual where your goods really were made. And those are rules that have been on the books for a very, very long time. And the enforcement capability around knowing where your goods are made is in large part thanks to technology. And someone had mentioned this earlier, probably, I think actually it was you, Gavin, that technology has expanded and making the capability to do more due diligence, to dive deeper into your supply chains possible. And conversely, it also makes the governments far better at enforcement. Are your valuations correct? Do you know your customer's customer, and not just know them, but know the types of goods that they're importing and exporting? Are they using trade lanes or cargo ships that they shouldn't be? So very practically speaking, a risk assessment is always the first thing that anyone here listening needs to do. You need to actually understand what risk you have, and then assess each area of your business that touches that. Put in policies and procedures that govern that specific risk area. You need to train everybody on that, train it again, monitor them with some of this new technology, keep records, because you might get involved in a situation where you need to prove, what you can or can't do.
Great. And I mean, I think, Vedia, is quite interesting hearing that from Anne-Marie, and just thinking about what you were saying about expecting the manufacturer to provide you with that documentation. We've had quite a few questions, actually.
Yeah, I saw one that.
Yeah. So I don't want you to give a specific at DHL we require this, but just generally, I think, what's the sort of the tone in the logistics services sector in terms of what you feel you really expect from that manufacturer in terms of documentation?
Yeah. So unfortunately, we've had some instances where our customers told us they had a license, and then when we pressed on it and we got the copy of the license, it was either expired or it was a totally different license. It wasn't within scope for those goods. So to answer that question that I see in the Q&A, due to sensitive information that may be on the license, do you accept a general correspondence on the company letterhead validating the request? No, we don't, because of this. Because saying on a company letterhead even that the license exists, we have to trust but verify, and we can't verify if we don't see a copy of the license. So what we ask is, if there's any confidential business information you don't want to share with us, redact it and send a redacted version to us. We just need to know, we need to see the scope of the license. Within each OFAC or BIS license, there's going to be a section that tells you what the scope of the license is. We're interested in that. Got
it. Thank you.
And the expiration date, obviously.
Yeah. Now, there's lots of questions, and unfortunately, we talked about it earlier, and I thought there would be questions about, Anne-Marie, I'm thinking about what we discussed around financial institutions. Mm-hmm. So a lot of questions say, well, okay, we've heard what the logistics firms are doing. We've heard what's going on at sea, or what might be going on at sea. We've heard what manufacturers are doing. Alongside all of this are the banks that are financing all of this activity. What are they supposed to do? Do they have to track everything? Do they have to know everything? What do they need to comply with?
Well, they have had their world rocked in the past year. And if history serves as any guide, the next step is a big, bloody enforcement situation. So I think very, very soon we're going to find out a lot more specifics to some of these questions about very detailed, what does OFAC expect about this or this aspect, because they're looking for just the right enforcement case, I believe, to detail all of that out to us. But immediately what we know is that for the first time, really, banks must not just do some nice little dual use goods list check. They must actually perform real live export determination. What's the product? Where's it going? To whom and why? And they need to make sure that anything that comes back in those 4 questions is appropriately addressed from a risk level. And there's not a lot of guidance about exactly what that means, but banks' appetite, insurance companies' appetite for risk is very, very low. There's been a steady drumbeat. SAR transactions in the US must now incorporate EAR 99, which means non-controlled, non-dual use goods that you may be, you may be financing. And then last week, I'm sorry, about a week and a half ago, actually now, the executive order that essentially led to the decision to greatly expand EAR 744, put a lot of financial directional control information in a more aggregated way. And you can find that in the EAR 744 Part 8. And everyone would be well advised to carefully evaluate transactions, even if they fall outside of OFAC's jurisdiction. So I had the pleasure this week to speak to Jason Prince. He is the immediate past chief counsel to OFAC. And we specifically talked about OFAC 50 and whether the unnamed OFAC 50 individuals and companies that meet that threshold from a strict legal perspective, they are not covered within this new rule. However, depending on a company's risk profile and your risk appetite, it would be prudent to adopt a more conservative, broader approach, especially within banks, that has generally extended EAR to all blocked persons. That's a matter of compliance policy and practice. So given for our manufacturers, given the extensive de-risking in which financial institutions often engage, and even more so now, you should be prepared for them to refuse to participate in any transaction involving a person blocked by virtue of OFAC's 50% rule, even if the transaction clearly falls outside of OFAC's jurisdiction and doesn't violate plain language of the EAR. Banks are working on ramping up to this themselves, and it's going to be a learning curve. You need to be nimble as you navigate through this. And I've never met a nimble bank. So it's going to be an interesting, year, I believe. But that's really from the horse's mouth.
I've never met a nimble bank. That's
No.
that may be my experience too, but it wouldn't be for me to say. Listen, we've got about 2 minutes left. Michelle, we've got two questions that I want to address to you. You've got 30 seconds on both.
Okay, no pressure.
Who insures the dark fleet, the shadow fleet? Who's insuring it? Second question, someone who's using Lloyd's List Intelligence or other tools, how do they know if their AIS is being spoofed?
Okay, first question, 80% of the dark fleet have no known in P&I coverage, and that means that they are operating outside the 12 clubs that form the international group of P&I clubs. The remainder are field.
Can you just explain what P&I is?
Protection and indemnity. I'm sorry.
No, don't. You live shipping.
We're full of acronyms. And secondly, in terms of Lloyd's List Intelligence, yes, we do. We have a range of products to identify, AIS spoofing and AIS gaps, etc. I mean, that's our bread and butter, really. And of course, shipping is very, very vulnerable to sanctions, and there is definitely increased fears of becoming designated as a result of this increased QuintSeal scrutiny in the QuintSeal compliance note.
Fantastic. Thank you so much. Last question, Vedia. There's a mention about jurisdictions. Are there jurisdictions that if a jurisdiction comes up as part of a transaction, as part of a individual or entity associated with a transaction, that you just go, alarm bells, I'm worried? obviously Iran, obviously Russia, obviously Crimea. But someone mentioned Marshall Islands, jurisdictions where there's less transparency.
Honestly, Marshall Islands haven't been much of a problem for us, but we are seeing a trend involving Dubai free trade zones.
Right.
I think that's where all the companies must pay attention to. I'm speaking to US manufacturers and suppliers here. Please know your customer. Do your due diligence, because we're seeing some trends, and I think a lot of the Russia sanctions evasion is going through Dubai.
Definitely.
Listen, I'm really sorry. We are at time. There's lots and lots of questions. Thank you, everyone that sent in questions. I'm going to do my best to go through those. I'll share them with the other speakers, and we'll do our best to address them. Michelle, Anne-Marie, Vedia, thank you all so much for your time. Well done for making it through it, Vedia. Have a lie down and rest. Please get to soon. Michelle, Anne-Marie, get back on with your work. And thank you all for listening for the past 45 minutes, and we'll be in touch soon. Thanks everyone so much.